So today we'll be doing this passage on what color do you see. So this is a passage on different human experiences while experiencing the same factual thing or same thing in reality. We the past behavior was to differentiate between how people would accept or reject stuff or think about them, but new study and new ways of surveying people have brought up the idea that people are going through different experiences while experiencing the same thing. So let's get started. On 26th February 2015, Kate Holderness, a BuzzFeed community manager, posted a picture of a dress captioned, "There's a lot of debate on Tumblr about this right now and we need to settle it." The post was accompanied by a poll that racked up millions of votes in a matter of days. About two-thirds of the people saw the dress as white and gold, the rest as blue and black. The comment section was filled with bewildered calls to go check your eyes and all caps accusation of trolling. So definitely there was a big dilemma and very discussion about what the color actually was. There was a lot of debate, trolling back and forth. Vision scientists were quick to point out that the difference in appearance had to do with the ambiguity in ambient light of the photograph. If the visual system resolved the photograph as being taken indoors with its warmer light, the dress would appear blue and black, if outdoors white and gold. That spring, the annual Vision Sciences Society conference had the live demo of the actual dress, blue and black for the record, lit in different ways to demonstrate the different ambient light shifted its appearance. But none of this explains why the visual systems of different people would automatically infer different ambient light. So, like, we could see that based on the different ambient lighting, the colors were different, right? But this could not explain why each of the different people understood it to be a different color, right? Why the visual systems of different people would automatically infer or automatically think that it was a certain color like blue and black and not white and gold, or the other way around. Whatever the full explanation turns out to be, it is remarkable that this type of genuine difference in visual appearance could elude us so completely. Until the dress went viral, no one, not even vision scientists, had any idea that the specific discrepancies in color appearance existed. This is all more remarkable considering how easy it is to establish this difference. In the case of #TheDress, the trend, it's as easy as asking what colors do you see. If we could be oblivious to such easy to measure difference in subjective experience, how many other such differences might there be so that the that can be discovered if only we know where to look and which questions to ask. So this online debate sparked a huge like difference in understanding. Like until that moment, people used to think that we experience the same thing, and based on our past experiences or our intelligence or our thinking, we take things to be different. But this is something like fundamentally destabilizing to our thought, right? We do not experience the same thing as different persons. So this was something that opened up new ways of study. Take the case of Blake Ross, the co-creator of the Firefox web browser. For the first 3 decades of his life, Ross assumed his subjective experience was typical. After all, why wouldn't he? Then he read a popular science story about people who do not have visual imagery. While most people can, without much effort, form vivid images in their mind's eye, others cannot. It's a condition that has been documented since 1800s but only recently named aphantasia. Ross learned from an article that he himself had aphantasia. His reaction was memorable. Imagine your phone buzzes with breaking news. Washington scientists discover tailless man. Then what are you? So this is an example how the co-creator of Firefox web browser was a person suffering from aphantasia. That means he didn't have any mental or visual imagery. I mean that was his condition, right? So, like, to grow up with aphantasia and not know what other people have going on inside their system can be quite destabilizing, because for whole your life that you do not have any vision, and you also expect others to be of the same behavior. But when you know that others definitely have some kind of vision, internal vision or mental imagery, that can be quite destabilizing, because you have formed certain visions that you think the world is from your perspective, but others may not conform to it. So that's quite destabilizing. Ross went on to ask his friends about what's it like from them when they imagine various things, quickly realizing that just as he took his lack of imagery as a form of human condition, they similarly took their presence of visual imagery as given. "I have never visualized anything in my entire life," Ross wrote in Vox in 2016. "I can see my father's face or bouncing blue ball, my childhood bedroom, or the run I went on 10 minutes ago. I'm 30 years old and I never knew a human could do any of this, and this is blowing my goddamn mind." So Like he's just confirming what I just said. There is a kind of visceral astonishment that accompanies this type of hidden differences, which seem wedded to the idea that we experience things a certain way because they are that way. So the thing is, we make whatever we experience to be the law. Like we think that whatever we are going through is similar for everyone. So that is something fundamentally like clashing in this case of Roy, right? No, Blake Ross. In this case of Blake Ross, he considered that forming mental imagery be about anything about his father, his walk 30 minutes ago is something very normal. People can't do that. But when he came into exposure with his friends who told him otherwise, it was very like opened up his world in different ways and it was very destabilizing. Studying hidden differences like this can enrich our scientific understanding of the mind, true, and it would not occur to a vision scientist to ask whether being a night owl might have an impact on color perception, but a bunch of people on the internet comparing notes on how they saw a dress inspired just such a study. The study of aphantasia is helping us understand ways in which people lack imagery and can accomplish the same goals without using such explicit imagery, like like we can do various stuffs like memorize or something because of visual imagery, but how do the people cope without that kind of imagery? Like we can visualize some certain kind of maths problems or various other types of problems in life, but aphantasia aphantasics cannot do that, right? So how do they cope with that? How, what other ways they can use to survive those situations? How many other such examples might be there once we start looking? So these questions are starting to pop up. There is also arguably a moral imperative for us to study and understand these kind of differences because they help us understand the various ways of being human and to empathize with these differences. So we need to study this kind of differences because we need to create a very endearing and inclusive society and the world for these people, right? Because they are not an insignificant part of the human society and they need to be accounted for. They need to be helped and like provided with these support systems. It's a sobering thought that a person might respond differently to a situation not just because they have different opinion about what to do or are in possession of different knowledge, but because their experience of the situation is fundamentally different. So that is the main theme of the passage here. The difference is not in the knowledge, past opinions or past experiences, right? But how they experience the same thing differently. Like I may see something to be red in color, but you may see it to be different color, like green, black, anything else, right? So we are experiencing the same thing but in different ways. So that is the main clash that's happening here. For most of my research career, I didn't really care about individual differences. Like most of my cognitive scientists, my concern was manipulating some factor and looking into this manipulation and looking to see how this manipulation affected the group average. In my case, I was interested in the ways that typical human cognition and perception is augmented by language. And so, in a typical experiment, I would manipulate some aspects of the language. For example, I examined whether learning names of novel objects change how people categorize, remembered, and perceived them. These were typically group effect studies in which we compare how people respond to some manipulation. Of course, with such study, different people respond in different ways, but the focus is on the average response. So, the author is talking about his research on this field and tells about they did not really care about individual differences in experience or stuff like that because they were always going for the statistically average of the what the population told or the what the survey was, right? So in this case the individual differences were not really cared about. Some examples given below. For example, hearing green helps most people see the subtle differences between more green and less green color patches. Interfering with language by having people do a concurrent verbal task makes it harder for people to group objects together that share a specific feature, such as being of a similar size or color. But most people aren't everyone. Could it be that some people's color discrimination and object categorization is actively aided by language, but for others people less so? So by giving them a single avenue of exposure that can like controlling a single parameter is not fair to everyone, right? Because some may be actively aided by language as said here and others may be not. So thinking about this single parameter like language thought like brought up many other thoughts in the author's mind, right? What could be such other parameters like aphantasia where the mental imagery is not present, right? In particular, we began to look at inner speech, long thought to be a universal feature of human experience. So they also looked at inner speech, which was thought to be like very fundamental to human nature. Most people report to having an inner voice, like 83%. And similar proportion, 80% agree or strongly agree with the statement, think about my problems in my mind for a conversation with myself. So in both cases, you can see that 17 to 20% of the people don't. Like they fall to the other side of the spectrum, and 70 to 20% is not actually very insignificant number when you think about the entire subset of the people being surveyed, right? So we can't like not study about them. There is a moral requirement to study about them to account for their differences and to create better systems. But 85% is hardly everyone, just reflecting my thought. What about those who disagree with this statement? Some of them report experiencing an inner voice only in specific situation. For example, when it comes to reading, some say they hear a voice only if they deliberately slow down or are reading something difficult. But a small percentage report never experiencing an inner voice at all. Like those with aphantasia, who assume their entire lives that visual imagery is just a metaphor. And in Endophasia, the author and his friend Johann Edergaard coined the term. Like people with anendophasia do not have their internal voice speaking to them, right? They always think that internal voice is something very like is a metaphor talked about in various forms of media like books, TV series, and other stuff, right? It's tempting to think that is a trade-off between thinking using language and thinking using imagery. Take the widespread idea that people have different learning styles, some being visual learners or some being verbal learners. When it comes to imagery and inner speech, what we find is a moderate positive correlation between vividness of visual imagery and inner speech. On an average, those who report to having more visual imagery also report experiencing more inner speech. Most of who claim to not experience inner speech also report having little imagery. So, imagery and inner speech have shown to be, but through survey, have been shown to have a higher correlation. So, if you have a great visual imagery, chances are you also have great inner speech, right? And the other way around as well. This raises the question of what their thoughts feel like to them. When we have asked, we tend to get answers that are quite vague. For example, I think in ideas, I think in concepts. So people who do not have that kind of imagery or inner speech tend to answer in very vague terms, like they are not very good in explaining how they cope, right? We have lots of language at our disposal that we can use to talk about perceptual properties, and of course we can use language to talk about language. So it is not really surprising that people have trouble conveying what the thoughts without perceptual or linguistic format feel like. So it is very difficult to convey what it feels like for them. But the difficulties in expressing these types of thoughts using language don't make them any less real. But just because they are difficult, it does not make them that's not real. I wouldn't say suffer. They just have the different conditions, right? They can't create visual imagery. Like that's a different system. Like it shouldn't be treated as a disease, in my opinion. They merely show that we have to work harder to better understand what they are like. So, just what I said, they need to be accounted for. And better systems have to be created to support them as well. Difference in visual imagery and inner speech are just the tip of the iceberg. Other differences usually synesthesia, like you can understand. This is very common in musicians like John Mayer and other stuff and other people. Greek for union of senses, in which people hear lights, taste sounds. They like synesthesia is basically like your senses have different results. Like when you taste something, you can say salty, but for them, like when they taste something, different lights appear. Like they can see different stuff. So that is the description of synesthesia as I know it. And Eigengrau, a German word for intrinsic gray, when we close our eyes. So different examples given where people have different experience to the same thing, but they are not always accounted for and not always very clearly established or defined, and they need to be studied. Our memory too seems to be the subject of larger differences than anyone expected. In 2015, the psychologist Daniela Palombo and his colleagues published a paper describing severely deficient autobiographical memory, SDAM. A person with SDAM might not know that they went on a trip to Italy 5 years ago, but might know they went on the trip, but they cannot retrieve a first-person account of the experience. They cannot engage in mental time travel that most of us take for granted. As in the other case of hidden differences, these individuals tend not to realize they are unusual. As Claudia Hammond wrote for the BBC, Susie McKinnon, one of the first described cases of SDM, say she always assumed that other people told in-depth stories about their past, they were just making up the detail. So this is something I also relate to. What is it about differences in imagery, inner speech, synesthesia, and memory that render them hidden? It is tempting to think that it's because we don't directly observe them. We can see that someone is a really fast runner, but having direct access to only our reality, like our perspective of what actual reality is. However, we do know that another person imagines when they think of an apple, what they think of an apple, whether they hear a voice when they read. Still, we can't directly experience another person's reality. When we can compare notes by talking about it. Often it's remarkably easy for the trend. We just needed to ask what color we see. We can also ask whether letters always appear in color. People without imagery will tell you that they cannot visualize an apple, and those without inner speech say they do not hear the voice. It is not actually difficult to discover these differences when we start systematically studying them. So, these differences may be difficult to understand, but there are often like very easy ways to find them out when we start to systematically study them. Paradoxically, although language is what allows us to compare notes and learn about differences between our subjective experiences, its power to abstract may also cause us to overlook these differences because same word can mean very different things. So this is another problem while identifying these differences, because words and stuff can mean different things in different contexts and different times. We use imagine to refer forming an image in mind's eye, but we also use it when referring to more abstract activities like imagining a hypothetical future. It is perfectly reasonable for aphantastic to not realize that, and in some cases, people use imagine to mean actually forming mental images. So, similar. Much of our understanding of hidden differences relies on people's self-report. Can we trust it? Modern psychology is skeptical about self-report, a skepticism I've inherited as a part of my academic training. So the author also believes that self-reports may not always be a true reflection of what they actually feel or what they actually go through. Recently, large individual differences have been reported to be incredulous. How do we know that these differences reflect something real? Can we really just take people at their word when they say they do not have an inner voice? So some questions being raised about are the self-reports credible, and so yeah, that's also can also be a problem. Before tackling the more complex question of whether we should trust self-reports about internal subjective states like imagery and inner speech, let's consider some simpler cases. When someone says they dislike cauliflower, they're reporting on the subjective experience, and we tend to take them at their word, but we don't have to. So we can easily set up an experience where we observe how likely they are to eat cauliflower when given the alternatives. It would be surprising if someone claimed to not like cauliflower but chose to eat it at every opportunity. So obviously, if there is a inconsistency between what they say and what they do, we can always think that they were lying or they were not telling. The self-report was actually not a good one or a true one. There are of course cases where such stated versus revealed prefer gaps occur. Many researchers have made their career studying these gaps. For example, if one lives in a culture where cauliflower eating is associated with higher status, people may be compelled to say that they like it even though they don't. So, if there are such different imperatives that force them to make inconsistent self-reports, like inconsistent from their behavior, such studies are being made and they are very frequent as well. So there is another case where if you are in a shared office and your office mate says that they feel cold when the thermostat is set to 22 degrees Celsius, do you take them at their word, or do you say it's proper indoor temperature and how can you feel cold? Like you would probably take them at their word and think that they are feeling cold. Like it's not very, like we won't like measure their skin temperature, do all this kind of medical stuff like take an fMRI, core temperature, etc. and prove to them that they are not feeling cold. We just take them at their word, but it can also be wrong, it can also be inconsistent with what they are actually feeling, but mostly we take them at their word. This same logic applies to inherently subjective states such as loneliness, pain and awe. Like the same thing, like we usually take someone at their word when they say that they are feeling lonely, and we do not try to prove that they have been like what talking with people and doing stuff with people, but they actually feel lonely. We can't prove that, and we actually take them at their word. Like despite all available technology, we have to measure people's physiological states when it comes to pain. We continue to rely on pain scales, a simple form of self report. So when doctors ask you how much pain you are feeling from a scale of 1 to 10, we usually take that as a simple form of self report, and we take them at their word. One possibility is that we are able to reliably introspect about some things and not others. Perhaps we can reliably report on basic states like pain and whether we like cauliflower, but in other cases our introspection fails. Like these examples that our author mentions are very easy to self-report and very easy to understand and communicate with others, right? But others may not be. The so-called Lake Wobegon effect. We can also be wrong in the other direction. For example, drivers, they always think that they are better than other drivers, right? They belong to the higher percentiles of drivers, and they are actually better than the average, better than most people. And in also some kind of in other kinds of games, like in a game such with a rule, like they have to identify new sequences, whether new sequences obey the same rule or not based on past occurrences or past sequences, right? Participants often feel that they are just guessing it and they have not learned anything, but they actually may have, but they are under the impression that they have not learned anything and they are just randomly guessing. So this is another case of incorrect self-report, where there is a gap between what they are actually doing and what they actually reported. So there is this inconsistency. So these examples are given. Lastly, we can consider dreams. Fernando Tapia and colleagues reported that only 9% of respondents indicated that their dreams contained color. Other surveys done around this time reported similar low proportions. A decade later, the tide turned and a large majority reported dreaming in color. The philosopher Eric Schwitzgebel considers that several explanations for this discrepancy. One possibility is the color TV. Like we used to have black and white TV, so our dreams were in black and white, but the color TV changed that. There is a problem with this theory that the world was always in color, right? So why should our dreams be dependent on the television and not just other aspects of the world? So the alternative argues, so this was the alternative argument, and there were no objective measures against which to measure the subjective report. We can't really know whether these reports reflect any subjective or not. So we can judge consistency in these reports because all this stuff are very subjective, right? We can't understand what parameters influence people. Perhaps because in the absence of having good access to phenomenal states, people go with the responsible they think is most reasonable. So that was a very reasonable parameter to guess. The TV was very reasonable parameter. In the 1950s, the dominant popular and scientific view was that dreams lack color. And so when queried, participants simply mirrored the dominant view. The same happened as the dominant view later changed. Neither case, Schwitzgebel argues, reflects correct phenomenology because we simply do not have valid introspection when it comes to color of our dreams. So it was one of the parameters that was mentioned, and there can be many different ones, and we do not know what exactly it was, right? So we cannot prove that to be wrong. So that was the main conclusion of the passage. If reports about phenomenal states like imagery in inner speech are like reports about dreams, we have every reason to remain skeptical of whether differences in introspection report actual differences in people's actual experiences. If there are more like reports of our preferences and emotions, then we can mostly take people at their word. Even then, we must consider social pressures to respond in a certain way. So different stuff like social pressures and different of this stuff can influence what they actually self-report. If having vivid imagery were a requirement for admission to art school, we should not be surprised if aspiring artists all claim to have vivid imagery. Understandable. And if hearing a voice when one reads considered a sign of mental illness, people will be less likely to say they hear a voice when they read. So we do not want to associate ourselves with mental illness, right? So we would all say that we can hear a voice when we read. So these societal pressures can also influence what we report. So the author is pointing out why inconsistency in social self-reports can occur. So and social anxieties and societal pressures are one of the reason. Establishing the validity of self-report can be done in several ways. First, we must show the consistency. Like there should be consistency of report and the action, and as well as a report in as well as a consistency in report taken in different intervals of time. So as it turns out, people's reports are highly consistent. Inner speech questionnaires taken months apart show high correlations. We can also see whether differences in reported phenomenology predict differences in objective behavior. This is not an option when it comes to dreams, but we can make specific predictions or behavioral consequences of having more or less visual imagery and inner speech based on existing theories of imagery and language. Differences in self-reported phenomenology can be linked to differences in objective behavior. Those with less inner speech have harder time remembering list of words. Those with less visual imagery report fewer visual details when describing past events. So a correlation between these conditions and what they actually behave in real life is being portrayed here. There are also reported differences in automatic physiological responses. More light entering the pupil can cause it to constrict, but thinking about the bright sun can also have the same effect. So if you have great mental imagery, if you think about the sun, it has been found that your pupil will constrict because you are thinking about a huge light source. While aphantasic people do not have that reaction, right? So there is a difference in the automatic physiological stuff in going on in our body as well. The people with poor autobiographical memory find other ways of keeping track of information that can help them stave off some of the cognitive decline in aging. So they find different ways to cope that may be helpful for them as well. Another way to establish validity is that we can ask whether there are neural and physiological correlates of reported phenomenal differences. If differences in reported imagery were mere confabulations or the results of people just telling researchers what they think the researchers want to hear, it would be surprising if they had different brain connectivity and functional activation as measured by fMRI. Yet this is what we are finding. Fraser Milton and colleagues scanned groups of people identifying as aphantasics and hyperphantasics. When asked to lie in the scanner, they stare at a cross on the screen. The brain responses of hyperphantasic group had greater connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the occipital visual network compared to the aphantasic group. So different neural and physiological effects can be studied based on what condition they, what state they belong in, right? Like aphantasics have different form of connection or different stuff going on in their brains than the hyperphantasics, and these were actually studied. The difference in activation between perception and imagery was larger in hyperphantasic compared with aphantasic participants. Those with typical imagery tend to fall in between aphantasic and hyperphantasic. Less is known about neural correlates of the inner speech. So less is known about the inner voices and other stuff, but there was also a study done based in the Society of Neurobiology of Language by Hui-Chao Yang and colleagues found a relationship between how much inner speech people reported to experience and resting state functional connectivity in the language network. So there is a correlation between what people are, what state they are belonging to, like aphantasics or hyperaphantasics, and there is also an connection between that and what is going on in their brain while connecting to the language network or the various parts of the brain. So there is a neural correlation. Lastly, even though we don't know what's it like to be someone else, we can compare how our phenomenology differs from one time to other. There are numerous reports of people with brain injuries that cause them to lose visual imagery and some cases of losing inner speech. So there are reports where people lose this kind of mental imagery and like inner voice based on accidents or different other stuff. And the self-reports, there are self-reports that say that they used to be visualizing stuff but they can't now. So this is very common. Holderness's caption introducing the world to the trend had a second part. This is important, she wrote, because I think I'm going insane. The idea that the same image looks different to people is alarming because it threatens our conviction that world as we experience it. So we have this preconceived notion that the world is what we see it to be and what I as an individual think it to be. So this trend proves that it's not so. Like people view the same thing in different lights and have different experiences based on the same thing. So we need to account for everyone. When aphantasic learns that other people form mental images, they are learning that something they did not was even a possibility is a fact, many people's everyday reality. This is understandably destabilizing. So when you lead when you have like experience a lot like longer years of the life thinking that what I do or what I don't do is the main way, right? Like that is the only thing that can be happening inside a human, and later in life we get to know that it is not normal, and I am not the like this phenomena is the not the only one. It's not universal. It can have destabilizing effects on us, right? So like the conceived notions, preconceived notions that we created about the universe or the world or about humans can be shattered, and it's quite destabilizing. And yet there is a scientific and moral imperative for learning about the diverse forms. Scientifically it prevents us more from making claims that the majority experience is everyone's experience. Morally it encourages us to go beyond the ancient advice to know thyself, which can lead to excessive introspection. So this kind of goes against the ancient advice know thyself, because obviously we should know what we are and how we function and all the stuff, but we should not take our experience to be the ground truth, because people can experience the same stuff in different ways, and we need to take them into account, and we need to create a more inclusive society. And to do that requires we open ourselves to the possibility that experience may be quite different from our own. So that's the conclusion of the entire passage, and it was a great passage on establishing that how the same thing can be seen in different light and it can be experienced in different ways. Thank you.